that. So we are excited now to continue in this same vein, thinking about workforce and some of the critical leadership and management components and those things that we all need to have in our toolbox. So I'm excited to bring in two of our representatives from UKG. In case you haven't heard UKG, I know you've heard that around NASCA, but this is formerly Kronos. So these are our friends who have been good partners, excellent partners of NASCA for some time now. We have Pat Bennett, who is the Group Vice President from UKG, and also Chas Fields, who is the Senior Partner for HCM Advisory Group and also HR. If you had an opportunity to be with us for their learning lab back in December, you know, we went pretty deep into a topic in Georgia that was so critically important to their correctional system, really looking at personnel management and how they were able to overcome just a very big challenge around overtime in the correctional and prison system. It was an excellent opportunity. Please go to NASCA's Knowledge Center, watch that on demand. But we wanted to really take an opportunity today to expand that conversation a little bit more into some of the priorities around workforce management, which UKG does so eloquently. So Scott, I'm gonna let you kick us off with Pat and Chas.
And Chas, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. So I had an easy run of this as I was preparing my questions, because I noticed on LinkedIn that a former boss of mine is she's a head of HR for a big European pharmaceuticals company, actually sits on something called the UKG Workforce Institute. And the Institute recently issued its predictions for 2021. So I was going to present to you both the predictions from your own Workforce Institute and have you reflect that through the lens of states and state chief administrative officers. But before we go any further, Patrick, would you just describe your role with UKG, and Chas, I'd ask you to do the same.
Yeah, sure. I'm the Group Vice President for Public Sector for UKG. By the way, we announced the merger between Kronos and Ultimate, I think a week before the pandemic really started. So, you know, we've tried to merge two multi-billion-dollar companies into one without ever meeting together. So it's been an exciting year. But I'm the Group Vice President for Public Sector. So states, local government, federal, some not-for-profit. My team works with many of the people on the webinar and others. Chas?
Hey, thanks, Pat, and thank you all for having us today. So I'm a senior partner of the HCM Advisory Group. My role is broken up into three ways. We do a lot of consulting for our customers and prospects. I also do a lot of thought leadership on behalf of UKG, writing for HCM Tech and HCM syndicates, and then we do a lot of public speaking. Our team does a lot of public speaking at various conferences, shows, panelists, things like that. So thank you all for being here.
Welcome both. So I'm going to start with one of my most disliked metaphors, which is that we have to build the plane while we're flying it. But one of the predictions of the UKG Workforce Institute is that that's exactly what's going to be happening with workforce practices during 2021, that we're going to be evolving and changing these practices while living and working in them. So let's just help out our CAOs here. How do they do that? So you're running an organization, and what are the sort of criteria that they should be asking with regard to which workplace practices stay and which go as we evolve through this sort of pandemic journey?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, as we think about 2021, as we try to compare and contrast, particularly at a high level, we really only have 9 months of data because, you know, the pandemic started, let's say March, right? So maybe 10 months of data. So we think about financial viability and sustainability, like, and kind of marrying that with employee health, which is so important. And I think Bernice and Herman spoke so eloquently about. I think in the past, particularly in private business, a strong CEO and a strong CFO operated pretty well together, and an organization could survive. I think what's definitely changed now, as we call this great reset, is there needs to be a triumvirate. It's the CEO, it's the CFO, and a very strong CHRO, or in our state's cases, a strong administrator. And I think like what we're trying to do is think about the financial stability of the state or of the agency, or in private business, you name it. But also thinking about how do we protect people? So we're protecting people, we're protecting our employees, we're working with constituents, and we're also protecting our bottom line. It was interesting, you know, Herman talked about his service on boards. I serve on the executive board of the Well Coffee House, which is based out of Nashville, Tennessee, where I live. We have 4 stores, And just yesterday, we were thinking about, okay, what do we budget for 2021? We know we got PPP money in 2020. We think there's more coming in 2021, but how do you even compare? Like, what should our volume, like, how do you predict the volume? How do you predict the expenses? It's so difficult to look at year over year compares and figure out how do we take care of our employees and how do we have the fiscal sustainability? Chas, I know you had some thoughts on this one as well.
Yeah. I love how Bernice touched a little bit on this, but I think the point that you're making is prior to this, a lot of times HR is viewed as, the administrator person or the paper pusher or anything like that. I think the reality of it is what's happened is for CAOs or CHROs, they've earned a seat at the table now. These are the individuals that deal with employees day in and day out. And when COVID-19 hit, the first call wasn't necessarily to the CEO. It was, okay, who deals with our people day in and day out, right? But from more of a tactical perspective, I think it's more important now than ever to work interdepartmentally. From a finance perspective, one of the examples I would say is what's your burn rate? What's your burn rate and how long can you sustain to keep employees working over the course of the next 6 months? Because we don't know if we're going to get shut down again, right? But playing those out 3, 6, 9, 12 months down the road so you understand and we can continue to have employees at work. Same thing with a hybrid model and returning to the workplace. We're already seeing it in the private sector where remote work is impacting in a very positive way from a financial perspective, right? People aren't doing things like re-upping their lease, or they're looking for potentially, hey, we're populating 6 months out of the year. How do we go about that? Or, should we receive a discount for a smaller space or a smaller workspace? So I would compare that, right? We need to take a look at finances, but we also need to make sure that we're taking a look. How do we keep employees working and understand what that burn rate is?
So if I understand this correctly, it's less about this is what your plan should be. It's almost throw away the strategic plan because there's so much ambiguity out there, but look at your decision-making infrastructure and invest the time in making sure you've got cross-departmental teams across agencies within state government, but probably even that relationship with the governor's office. And it's more than the raw numbers or what the public health authorities are saying at that time. It's how are you keeping that culture and keeping people productive and mentally healthy at the same time. A lot of sleepless nights in 2021, I suspect, for many of us. Okay, let's come to prediction 2, because I think this is related to it. Prediction 2 is intriguing to me from your institute, which is that trust is going to be imperative for successful organizations. If we're having this discussion a year ago, I dare say that cloud services would have been in that slot, and now we use the word trust, which is fascinating to me. What does that mean? What does that look like? And how do CEOs build trust in their organizations remotely?
I think you could say cloud HCM services even, and that would be appropriate. We're okay with that. But I think it's a great question, Scott. I don't think building trust is like a government versus private sector issue. I believe that building trust is a human/leadership issue, and all of us need to do it, whether it's in our personal lives or in our professional lives. And some of the questions I just ask myself as I think about, am I building trust with my team, is am I doing what I say I'm going to do? Am I meeting my commitments? And I think that's the same type of questions we need to ask the people that report to us. Are you doing what you say you're going to do? It's just a simple, fundamental human thing. Are you being a good human being in terms of meeting your commitments? Are we being proactive in our communication? I think as leaders, sometimes we probably don't communicate enough. We think we've said it once and that's enough. I think Patrick Lencioni, a great leadership expert, says you got to say it 5 to 10 times. You're the chief repeating officer basically in your organization. I have a friend and an ex-boss who worked at UKG for many years, just a phenomenal leader. And his tagline was, are you or are we being consistent and predictable? He said that all the time, all across the business. Are we being consistent and predictable? No one likes surprises. And then I also think, as we talk about this return to work and our employees working remotely, do we assume trust or do we make people earn it? And I think there could be arguments on both sides, but I think there needs to be probably a little bit more of the assuming trust when people are working remotely as opposed to them earning it. And I think it depends on the department and the person, obviously. But at the end of the day, one of the things that I like to say is, in the absence of information, do I think the best or do I think the worst? and I can go negative really quickly. Like, okay, I'm not getting feedback, like something's wrong. But I think that if we can condition ourselves to say, okay, in the absence of information, I'm going to think the best, that is a good place to be, but it's really hard. Chas, I know you have an interesting concept on this one.
Yeah, so I'm actually writing a piece on the study that they're referencing right now for a syndicate, and as I work through this with myself and with employees and those around me, I take it a step further, right? I take it a step to the point, where did we lose trust, right? An employee goes through this interview process. They've already decided to work for your organization. You know, we call it the Yelpification of employment, where I can Google your organization and decide, is this a place that I want to work, right? And they go through this, big, long process, hopefully not too long, recruiting and an application. And then you sit down and it's like, yeah, this person, I trust that they're going to do a job and do it well. And then I have to ask myself, when did we lose that as an organization? Or when did the employee lose trust in the fact that I chose to work here and this is good for me? And it really does boil down to a little bit further. It's where trust and respect intersect. And the bottom line is, doesn't matter if it's COVID-19, it doesn't matter if it's something that's affecting your personal life. It's really about the ability and where respect and trust cross, and do I trust that individual, or does that individual have the ability to get the job done no matter where they are? And if I respect that they can do that, I should trust them. Or if I trust that they can do that, I should respect that the job is going to be done and be done well. So super, super important. I think there's a lot of room for managers to grow in this. More importantly, it really does start at the top with leadership. I love the way that Pat describes it. It's repetitive, right? It's repetitive. I can say it, but I also need to show that I can do it too, and have that behavior and exemplify that behavior that exudes trust, exudes respect, and really exudes you as a person has the ability to get the job done.
Chas, I know you and Pat both have given us some excellent tidbits for our state chief administrators that, really showing that human-centered management, looking at outcomes-based versus what we used to call butts and seats hours. It really is, are we able to complete what's been asked of you? I also think it's important, though, that we flip that and think about the fact that trust and respect has to be reciprocated. So do you have thoughts or any nuggets you want to share with the audience on how that happens from the employee up through their managers up to the chiefs?
Do you want to start?
I was going to ask you if you want to start.
Yeah,
Pat.
yeah. So reciprocation, right? The first thing is, for me, it's awareness, right? It's self-awareness. This goes twofold. Am I, as a chief HR, executive, or am I a chief administrative officer, providing resources for my employees to understand components of mental health? Now, inside mental health, you have a huge opportunity to think about self-awareness, right? For me, every meeting, I kid you not, every meeting that I attend, or any conference or speaking engagement, whatever it is that I do, I ask myself, was that helpful? And did it help others, right? And I think about that, and I open up those emotions for myself personally to say, okay, am I self-aware in this moment to say, you know what, probably shouldn't speak about that again, or was that helpful? It's more about the education, right? We have to educate our employees to be self-aware, to have some of that self-reflection, and to reciprocate. Hey, look, I trust you to get your job done at home. Let's talk about that. And then I also, as a manager, need to be willing to hear that feedback, and vice versa. So it's a continuum. There's always room for constant improvement. But for me, an employee isn't going to be the first one to step up and say, hey, I've got all this resourcing about self-awareness and how I can make the organization better. That often the responsibility falls on executive leadership or senior leadership. And if somebody brings that to the table from an employee level, being willing to hear that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's very helpful.
Can we sort of stay in this realm, though, of employee performance? Because I think there's a fair amount of discussion and some degree of skepticism about whether people are working effectively from home. There's also another worry that people are overworking from home. Now, we know that UKG has a whole fleet of software aids and solutions around timekeeping and reporting. And on our last session with UKG, we had a great session, as Pam mentioned, around the Department of Corrections and being able to analyze work patterns to identify challenges and problems. What should CAOs be thinking about in terms of overwork and the stress of employees? And one of the predictions was that 2021 was going to stretch all organizations to their limit. So what are things that CAOs should be watching for, and how might we monitor for that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Scott. Like, even though we trust our employees and hopefully they trust us, we still got to maintain compliance and you got to pay folks correctly. And the overwork thing, I haven't put a lot of thought in that, but as I think about my own life, like there's not a lot to do except stay here and stream stuff or work. Although I did get COVID in December, so I guess I'm immune and free now, depending on who you talk to. But I think we've got to give our employees the tools to be effective. Particularly to your point in terms of working from home. I saw a stat from Deloitte this morning that said between March 2020 and April 2020, there were 30 million users that joined Microsoft Teams. Like, who would have ever thought that? That's not Zoom. That's not just Zoom or GoToMeeting. That's Microsoft Teams only. And I think like when people are working remote, it's really simple for us to think about them being out of sight and out of mind. So like just one of the tactical things that we try to do is obviously our leaders have one-on-ones with their people every week. And if you could just ask them, we do ours on Friday, but say, okay, what are your 5 goals, employee, for next week? What would you like to accomplish in the next week? They can be tactical, they can be high level, but they have to be measurable. And then the next one-on-one, you follow up. Okay, how'd you do? What are your 5 for next week? So I think that just, it just makes people feel connected and there's something attainable. It doesn't really answer your question, are employees overworking? I think that's really hard to go figure out.
But Patrick, that would be a gauge in a sense for you to say as somebody's supervisor, I think maybe that's a little ambitious for next week, and we might want to
absolutely
set expectations.
Yeah. If they have 5 things that are going to take them 10 hours each to accomplish on top of all their other stuff, then I think it's a great gauge. And then I think like if you think about our employees that aren't necessarily remote, but they're still working in state government, the employees at the DOC, the DOT, nursing care, how do you measure, or how do you mold together the fact that we have to have staffing levels, but there's this element of fatigue with our employees as well. We got to have people working in these agencies that it's critical. We have to have corrections officers. We have to have nurses. So what kind of tools can I give my team? Maybe it's self-scheduling. Maybe it's the ability to go in via my mobile app and say, I can only work these days, or I've got a class this night, or my kid's at home from school, I need to be here for that. And then trying to measure that with the business. But it's a balance of both, and it's difficult. Chas, I know you were talking last night, particularly how this affects to the Gen X and the Gen Zs. You want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a confession. I'm a proud millennial. I'm okay with admitting that because it's a little bit different, I think, for Gen X and Gen Z, right? When our generation and next generation steps into the workplace, the expectation is to have good technology, period. I don't want to walk into your organization and take a step back from anything that is not easier to use than my iPhone or my smartphone, right? 8 out of 10 people worldwide have a smartphone. 7 out of 10 have a social media account, right? And this is not a UKG pitch. It's just a reality, right? For us, it's more so in the way that we communicate and setting those expectations, but also leveraging technology to digitally speak to us. It's a lot easier for our generation to send a text message than it is to pick up the phone and have a 15-minute conversation, right? In the same token, to Pat's point, he sets goals week over week. Our generation is very goal driven. So for me, I use my notes on my phone, right? So it's really, really important not to lose sight of the technology piece. But beyond that, if you are implementing processes or policies and procedures, or you're still doing things that are paper-based or still very, very manual, and you decide, hey, look, I'm going to go digitize this, and it's the same process. You're just using a software. That's not good enough. So when you think about it as you go through this, if you're implementing new software or thinking about your digital strategy or transformation, really think about how your workforce is going to react to this. And although it may be the old way of doing things, we need to step away and cater to the upcoming generations in the workforce and how they're going to be most productive and efficient.
So the team at JLL were talking about treat this as an opportunity to blow up the way that you do things as much as kind of protecting the legacy way of doing things. I want to stay in that realm because the final prediction of the UKG Workforce Institute was around the role that technology will play and how fundamental it's going to be in the workplace. But I wanted to ask you the difference between thinking strategically about technology and tactically about technology. Sort of which are the quick fixes that you sort of roll out to get through the 2020 and 2021 zone, and which are those that you should be thinking more fundamentally about? And Chas, I think you were touching on this idea of don't just roll out the app that repeats your legacy processes. But let's go a little deeper into that space. Patrick, what do you have?
Yeah, Chas has got a great tagline on this, but just before he talks about that, it's interesting. So like in the healthcare arena before, we had the scheduling solution. And when a shift opens up, like a nurse calls out, and this could be relevant for mental health too in states, but a nurse calls out and it opens up a shift, which we have to have a RN filling that shift with certain skills and certifications. In the past, our software would call the next nurse in line that would be qualified. The pickup rate, terrible, 10%, 20%. The nurse would see the hospital like, I ain't working. We shifted that to email, maybe got a little bit better, but when we shifted it to text, so now the system automatically sends out a text, 80% response rate. Yes or no, I want the shift, fill the shift. Beautiful process. So I think as we think about technology and Gen X versus millennials, so on and so forth, thinking about what works for each generation, but everybody texts now. So shifting to your question, Scott, Chas, you had a great line about being tactically strategic or strategically tactical. So talk about that.
Oh, that sounds like a consultant line. Come on, let's hear it.
Yeah, don't peg me. Don't peg me too much for that. I think no, I shouldn't say that. I care a lot about the people to make sure they understand it, right? So when I step into an organization or I'm talking at a conference, we get a lot of questions, and I'm sure Herman and Bernice are in the same realm. I always ask the question: is it more important to be strategically tactical or tactically strategic? Right? The answer is both. The answer is both. And the term that you used was quick fix. I don't believe in quick fixes, especially in the realm of data. And the reason I say that is data, as far as putting data together, is very, very tactical. Now, we have reports that we can run, and whether they're digital or not, right? But you think about the transaction that goes into data, and it's very, very tactical, whether your system's doing it or not, right? So when you think about strategy versus tactical, to me, it doesn't really matter if it's in a system or if it's in paper. What matters is the decisions and the experience that are being created from these based on the decision that you're making from the data, right? We think about surveys, something as simple as surveys. Sometimes you get too many. Sometimes there's not enough. Like, what's the equal balance there? But then I see a lot of organizations that are willing to push out a survey, and there's nothing more frustrating than receiving all of this data, and 6, 8, 10 months down the road, the employers are like, man, do you remember when we did that survey? I haven't seen any action from that, because we know that employees are constantly talking to each other, right? You heard it through the grapevine. Go work on a manufacturing floor and see how fast things spread, right? It's the same, right? So we have to take that feedback, but really we also have to leverage things like artificial intelligence from that data that give us recommendations. Doesn't mean you always have to execute, but gives us those recommendations or reviews those surveys. And you see things like perceptions, that keywords that employees are saying when they're filling out these surveys or answering those questions. And then we as CAOs and CHROs can sit down and say, man, I noticed that the sentiment is really negative amongst this group of employees. That's a quick fix, right? I can go sit down with each of those employees. Hey, tell me what's on your mind. Well, I'm pretty burned out on the work that I'm doing. Is there a way that I can be retrained, upskilled, cross-skill, which is very, very important in public sector, simply to negate that experience? Both matter, if that makes sense.
I think too, while it's a little bit tactical, if we can use AI to automate processes that we shouldn't have to get involved with, at management level. So if I've got 5 PTO requests from my team, and as opposed to me sitting down and thinking about the schedule and who has what in terms of PTO time off, like let AI deal with that. Put the inputs in and let the software deal with that, as opposed to requiring human intervention. The more, like with our solutions, we tell people, the more you can not touch it, the better. Let the system do its work and then manage and think strategically from there.
Yeah, people get concerned about AI a little bit too often, in my opinion. You see the commercials about big data and artificial intelligence. You know what I mean? How many of us have or use Siri on our phone? How many of us have an Alexa in our home to automate different things, or a Nest or whatever that is? It doesn't mean that you have to use every piece of that, but it will give you an opportunity to make recommendations and move forward. AI is just data. It's how do we go about using that data moving forward? And if the system can make that recommendation, Pat and folks on this call, let it, and then you make the decision. Before you know it, you'll be more efficient and more productive.
So you kind of go ahead, Pam. I'm sorry.
Sorry, Scott. I was just going to say, with the pandemic and with everything changing overnight, the word we all hate to use, we had to pivot, but truly that's exactly what had to happen in all the states. Some of those database decision-making opportunities went out the window. It was, what can we get done? What can we accomplish to meet the needs of our citizens and our employees? I think we're now coming back around to knowing the critical need for the data analysis. Are you all seeing that some of your clients in the states are saying, well, hey, we made some pretty quick decisions and we found that they worked? What are you seeing that kind of stuck in the states?
Yeah, I would say the states have done incredible work in trying to be flexible. I can't even imagine, like, with all the data and the problem, like, I just think like our public sector servants in the states have done phenomenal jobs. And now we're trying to figure out how to vaccinate everybody. So like, I don't even pretend to know everything that's coming at our chief administrators, but I know this, like across the board in terms of the people we've talked to, while they've been incredibly stressed, they have done a phenomenal job of communicating in most states and staying above the bar and just really doing a super job of thinking critically, communicating, and just pivoting and being in crisis mode all the time, but yet leading well. That's what I've seen, Chas. I don't know if you have any anecdotes.
Yeah, I'm gonna take it a step further, Pat. I think that's great. The resilience piece is phenomenal that you're talking to. It's a time of reflection, Pam. And now, as we continue to either go back to the hybrid work model or get people back in their workforce, it's about policy and procedure now. It's okay. We pivoted. We streamlined. We were more efficient. Now we've got to put it in writing. So as we're onboarding future employees and employees continue to come back, here's your expectation, right? And following through with your policies and procedures moving forward. Something simple that I often use when we work with companies is a process map. Here's the way we did it before. Here's how we're doing it now. Make sure that it's published somewhere so employees can see it and understand it, and make sure that we keep moving forward.
So, gentlemen, I'm going to try to summarize what has been an intense 30 minutes, actually. We've covered culture and technology and AI and the whole raft of things. So let's go with the technology first. Use this time to think about, you essentially flipped my question, which is use this time to think about what is strategic and tactical technology. Use AI for the tactical, for those low-end decisions, and then use technology to inform you for the tough, ambiguous strategic decisions. But then on the leadership front, it was very much about these are going to be ambiguous times. So our job as leaders is to be consistent. Chief Repetition Officer, I think you paraphrased, Patrick. keep communicating and keep checking in with people as humans to help manage that workload. So use the technology, but don't let go of the humanity as you
Yeah, Scott, just to kind of, I know we got to summarize here and be done, but like last April when the pandemic was fresh in my mind, or was fresh in everybody's minds, it was happening. I thought, how do I communicate to my team that we're going to be okay? And I thought, well, I'll put a video out, or no, I'll do an email. And so what I ended up doing, and I'm not tooting my own horn at all, it just came to me and it seemed to work, is like I called every one of my employees in the organization, 50 phone calls. Some of those calls lasted 2 minutes, some lasted 20, but it was just a check-in. How are you doing? Like, what can I do to help? How's your family? And I think everybody appreciated that. And it took a long time when you think about, spending that much time with 50 employees, but it was worth it. And so I think we have to put first things first, think about what's really important, and manage our time accordingly.
In the middle of a merger, by the way.
In the middle of a merger.
A $1 billion merger, multiple $1 billion companies.
It was worth it.
Kudos to you, Pat.
Yeah. Well, I think we land in that area of trust. And Pam, I'm reminded of our colleagues in Missouri when we were out there a few weeks ago, and I looked at Commissioner Steelman in the eye and said, why does this stuff matter? And she said, because states are one of the last government institutions that the American public trust, and we have to keep that together. And this combination of technology and humanity seems to be the way forward. Thank you both very much for your time. Pam, back to you in Lexington.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott, as well as Pat and Chas. Really enjoyed that conversation.